Hi guys, so this is going to be a wrap-up video or recent reads video of most of the books that I read from the middle of March, since I did my last update video, until the end of April. It wasn't a spectacular time for reading for me, but I think that if I don't do this wrap-up now, I might never talk about any of the books I read on this channel again. Most likely, although there might be one candidate among them for my best of the year list. Maybe, if the reading year continues the same way it started. So one of the books that I was reading in that update video, and the first one that I finished after that, was West by Carys Davies. This is the story of a man from Pennsylvania, and the story starts, I think, in the year 1815, when that man, our protagonist, reads some news about the discovery of ancient bones of some ancient, never before seen animal with giant tusks, so presumably the woolly mammoth. And this discovery has been made somewhere to the west, and our protagonist becomes obsessed with the idea of finding these animals, not just the bones, but the animals themselves. He doesn't exactly know where he's going to find them, he just knows that he will have to go west, to the western frontier or maybe beyond. And this idea really consumes this whole life, and he leaves his young 11-year-old daughter in the care of his sister and just sets off. The girl doesn't have a mother anymore, she died long ago, obviously leaving a hole in our protagonist's life that he now is trying to fill with a search for the animals. This is an interesting piece of writing, I thought, in the way that it manages to feel broad and epic, like a great American novel of Steinbeck's time, even though the author is Welsh. But it manages to feel epic while being extremely short, and the writing is actually pretty sparse, but what few words Carys Davies uses, she uses to the best effect, apparently. However, it still ended up not being exactly one of my favorites, because in the middle of the book, while reading the book, I realized something that made reading the book a little bit ridiculous. I realized, and I don't know why, I've never heard or seen anyone mention this before, but this is really, at the end of the day, The Alchemist retold. Except that the ending is a little bit more complex than that of The Alchemist. So me saying this isn't really a spoiler. But at the end of the day, this is just The Alchemist. And realizing that made reading it inadvertently funny for me. And I also think that at the end of the day, it is pretty forgettable. And I also read another historical novel, The Fortune of War by Patrick O'Brian. This is the 6th book in the series about the adventures of Captain Jack Aubrey of the Royal Navy and his ship's surgeon, Stephen Maturin, during the Napoleonic Wars. Although in this book, the enemy are actually the Americans. I have to say this is my second to least favorite book in the series so far, but not because it is bad by any means. It's just because for long stretches of the book nothing really happens. At the beginning there is this huge pile-up of catastrophes, which is comedic because of the sheer amount of bad luck that it takes. But after that we are once more becalmed in Boston, and figuratively speaking, becalmed. In the book before this one, Desolation Island, we were pretty literally becalmed. Desolation Island is actually my least favorite book in the series. I thought that up to and including the 4th book, each book in the series was better than the one before, with books 3 and 4, HMS Surprise and The Mauritius Command maybe being on par, maybe HMS Surprise is the better book at the end of the day because it works better as a standalone. But all in all, this is just a fantastic series, and it really doesn't have its equal in quality when it comes to historical novels with this nautical focus. It's just so funny in a sarcastic and yet charming and warm-hearted way, and I just love it and love the characters. Among the small books that I read in the last few weeks is The Reckoning by Edith Wharton, which is a bind-up of two short stories by Edith Wharton, The Reckoning and Mrs. Manstey's View. The latter is a story about widowhood, and it's a very tragic story about a woman whose life has become very small at the end of her days, very limited, very constricted. And The Reckoning is, by contrast, a story about marriage, or rather romantic relationships in general. And it is a story about two different concepts that are each in their own way extreme, but we get left with a feeling that maybe one of the extremes, one of the hells that are depicted might be the preferable one to choose. Another short book that I read, which I seem to have misplaced, or maybe I've already taken it to some little free library or other, is a short story or novelette by Hermann Hesse, which I'm sure has been translated into many languages, but maybe not as a book in its own right, but rather as part of a bind-up of short stories, novelettes by Hesse. It is called Der Lateinschüler in German, and I'd translate it as The Grammar School Student. It's really just the story of a young man, an adolescent, who learns a thing or two about life outside of school and of this make-believe world that he was hitherto a part of. It's a very short story, and I felt very detached from it most of the time, but at the end I felt unexpectedly affected by the end, so that's good. Then we have a fantasy novella, Companions on the Road by Tanith. I got this as a birthday present, and it was on my wish list, and I wanted it first and foremost because it is a bind-up of two novellas, Companions on the Road and The Winter Players, which I read a few years ago and absolutely loved, even though there was a really unfortunate glitch, I would say, towards the end. I link my review video, my spoiler-free review video for you, where I talk a little bit more about this. But The Winter Players is an amazingly atmospheric, lyrical piece of writing, and it gives me the chills even looking back on when I read it. Companions on the Road, the other novella, is, well, it certainly tries to be just as atmospheric and lyrical, but the thing that detracted somewhat from it for me was that the plot is an extremely uninspired, cliche fantasy story. It's really one of the low-hanging fruits of fantasy plots, I think. And so for me, the atmospheric writing fell flat because what was being told was so uninspired. But I'm still glad to have this book because of The Winter Players. And now we get to my standout book of March and April. It's Grendel by John Gardner. Grendel, the monster from Beowulf, tells his own story in this, the story of his, shall we say, relationship with the Danes of King Hrothgar's court, the development over the years, and he goes through all kinds of existential crises in the course of it. I have to say, this is a book that gets deeper and more impressive the younger you are, if you know what I mean. However, normally I would have gotten annoyed with the forced wittiness and the introductory level psychology and sociology told like it's some kind of momentous revelation. However, hearing it all through the mouth of a self-sabotaging monster who is on a struggling journey towards self-awareness was actually so much of a creative novelty that I didn't mind all that much. Plus, I'm always a sucker for witty lines about the psychology of how we create our realities and about the social dimensions of identity formation. And I have to say, I'm surprised that it took me years and years of being on BookTube and Bookstagram until I happened upon this little gem of a modern classic. On the other hand, we then have the firework of mediocrity and cliche that I am sad to say is How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu. This is the story of what happens when, in the year 2031, an ancient virus is set loose in the melting Siberian tundra. It is told as a series of vignettes, each with a new protagonist, and it's all stories about, well, about the developments, about how people cope with the catastrophic developments, about how they make do, about how society changes, the public response to the catastrophe, etc., etc. I think it's an interesting concept. However, the actual stories are all unimaginative and cliche in the extreme. One low-hanging fruit, one science fiction stereotype after another. And then on top of that, the rather lyrical title and the also pretty lyrical chapter headings are all downright misleading. Because, I mean, if you hear a title like this, How High We Go in the Dark, and then chapter headings in the form of chapter 1 is called 30,000 Years Beneath a Eulogy. Hearing those titles, you expect something pretty lyrical and something pretty imaginative and novel in the language and the writing style, right? But the writing here was just serviceable, just very perfunctory writing, nothing inspired about the style, about the diction. And every chapter also sounded quite the same. I got really bored with it after 3 chapters, and it never recaptured my interest, really. All in all, to say that I was underwhelmed by this pretty hyped up book would be putting it too nicely, really. I also read a bunch of romances in the last few weeks, most of them novellas, but I think I'm going to talk about them in a special dedicated video about best romances that I've read this year so far, soon, sometime in June or July. So these are all the books that I read since that last catch-up video in the middle of March. Could have been better, could have been much worse too, and at least there is one book on the pile that might be a contender for my best of the year list. I guess you can guess which one it is. I'm going to go out now, take a bus to the river and walk along the river because it's a rare sunny day outside today. I'll see you again very soon, guys. Happy spring reading. Bye.